the corn country of the Vale of Aldini, in the autumn of 1817. It was the settled opinion of the whole of Chalcot, an opinion the town had come to, as the most comfortable opinions always are, by studying the size of a man's granary, and never once troubling to open the door of it and thrust an arm into the heap, that a corn factor was to be trusted in exact proportion to the quantity of grain he was known to hold. The little house of garners had bought and sold the Vale's wheat and barley these 40 years from behind a plain scrubbed counter in a low weatherboard warehouse by the market cross, over whose door the name had been painted so long ago that the weather had taken the shine off it. The great new stores that the Duke of Wraxall was, that very year filling upon the wharf side he had bought below the bridge, stood behind a front of new brick and a range of sealed granaries so long, and a stack of subscriptions so lofty, that a carter bringing down his sacks felt he had strayed by mistake into the counting house of the bank itself, and lowered his voice accordingly. And the town, being human, drew the human conclusion and began to carry its custom from the plain old counter to the great sealed stores, in the settled certainty that a concern which could hold so much corn must deal a very safe bushel indeed. It is worth the setting down, because it is very nearly the whole of the story that follows, for the harvest keeps a truer account than any speculator, and can be neither talked up nor frightened down into swearing to a lie. The earth does the thing that was done to it in the sowing, and no other thing. And what is honestly grown and honestly sampled will answer for itself in the ricking, while what is cornered and hoarded against the poor will heat in the sack and rot in the dark. Though you gild the granary with a lord's own arms and subscribe to it before the quality. For it is one of the small mercies of the corn trade that it cannot, in the end, be argued with. A town may talk itself into anything. A projector's pamphlet will prove whatever its projector is paid to prove. A company may seal up granary after granary, until it has persuaded the whole of Aldeni that a great deal of borrowed money laid out on a rumor of famine is a safer thing to trust than 40 years of an honest sample. But a heap of wheat bought damp and packed close and left unturned through a warm autumn will heat and must and grow its own blue rot, whatever the ledger says of it, and no amount of subscription will keep sweet a granary that was filled in a hurry and closed against the air. That was the one fact in the whole affair that could not be got round, bought off, or talked over, and it was known, in the July of this history, to exactly one person of any consequence in Chalcote, and she was a woman whom the principal gentleman of the neighborhood was about to advise, before the assembled quality of 3 parishes, to take her opinions back to her sacks and keep them there among the mice. On a bright, blowing July forenoon, at the opening of the great new corn stores below the bridge, the fresh brick scrubbed, a cold collation laid out under a striped awning, the subscribers gathered to congratulate one another upon the fortune they were all about to make out of a hungry year. Aldus, Duke of Wraxall, delivered the judgment that the county would be repeating, with steadily increasing enjoyment, and at his own expense, for the better part of a 12-month. He was the chief proprietor of the concern, and the head of its list. The whole scheme had been got up chiefly on the strength of his name and his acres, and a great many opinions he had formed in town upon the science of commerce, the freedom of trade, and the picturesque uselessness of the little old corn factors, who dealt by hand and by sample, and could not engross in a 12-month what his capital should engross in a month. In his gloved hand lay the elegant pamphlet of the affair, prepared by a fashionable London projector named Mr. Hartop, who had never in his life stood on a threshing floor at harvest to feel whether the grain was dry, and who had demonstrated with beautiful figures that the late wet had ruined the standing crops of the whole kingdom, that bread must climb the winter through, and that a house buying grain fast enough and holding it long enough must in a very few months command the entire price of the county's loaf, and leave the little factors to the sparrows and the smut. A young woman who had come down to the wharf with her father, present upon the family's business, and asked for her opinion by nobody at all, had just observed, in a level and unhurried voice, that a heap of corn was worth precisely what it proved in the baker's trough 3 months on, and not 1 farthing of what it looked in the sack the morning it was bought, and that a house which meant to hold the whole Vale's wheat in a hurry against a famine had best look to its turning and its airing a great while before it looked to its price. The Duke did not look up from the pamphlet. Corn is no trade for a woman, Miss Garner. Grain is grown by men and bought by men. Leave the sacks to those who can lift them. And then, still without lifting his eyes, in the tone a gentleman keeps for a draught under an ill-hung door, that little granary by the cross is finished. Sell your scoop for old brass, and keep to your marketing. If Miss Garner has views upon the price of wheat, Mr. Sallow, she may cry them to her sacks by the peck, where I am told a timid opinion will always find a timid ear, provided it is offered often enough, and in a measure small enough, to excuse it. Within the month, Verity Garner had staked the whole life of her father's house upon the very sample he had told her to sell for old brass, and by the Michaelmas, after the harvest that this history turns upon. For this is very nearly the end of the story, and we shall come round to it in good order. But it is only fair you should know from the first what road the tale is travelling. The Duke of Wraxall, the most modern and the least anxious gentleman upon that whole side of the county, would be standing bare, headed at that same plain scrubbed counter, with his tall hat held against his breast, asking the terms of the young woman he had not, that July, troubled himself to look at, and the little house he had offered to buy up and shut, as a man buys a cottage to be rid of it for the sake of a view, would be, by the common consent of the very town that had laughed at her obstinacy all the summer through, the one concern in 3 parishes whose corn had not heated in the sealed dark, and whose bakers had not been ruined by it. And when his aunt asked him, with the family plainness, what in heaven's name he had meant that morning under the striped awning, his Grace would discover, to his very considerable discomfort, that he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it at all. But that is a harvest, and part of an autumn on. This is the July before, and we must begin where she began, which was, as it happened, standing on the warm boards of the upper floor of Garner's granary, with a wooden shovel and a small linen bag, turning a parcel of new wheat to keep it from heating, and drawing off a handful to be tied and dated and laid by, a full hour before the Duke pronounced her caution a thing for the sacks, and thinking of nothing on this earth grander than whether the wind would hold in the north another day, and keep the loft dry enough to let the new corn sweat off its harvest heat before she closed it down. Verity Garner, V to the Carters and the loft, and to nobody genteel, for she had never once invited it, Miss Garner to the town, and the Garner girl to such persons as felt her continued existence wanted a syllable of apology, was 27, the only child of Silas Garner of Shalcote, corn factor, sole holder of the little house that had bought the Vale's honest wheat for 40 years and never yet sent a baker a sack he could set his name against and be sorry. Her mother was 12 years gone, her father, left with a grave, watchful daughter who asked what things cost and remembered the answer, did the only sensible thing a busy man could, and put her to use. She had kept the corn book and the market book, which is to say the account of every parcel bought and every baker served, its price and its measure and the sacks it drew in a year, since she was 18. She could tell you to the peck and the penny what any harvest of the last 9 years had cost, and what it had fetched, and to the quarter how much sound grain lay turning under the roof of Garner's loft. And she had, besides, a rule her father had taught her as other fathers teach a catechism. A heap is only ever as good as the handful, old Silas liked to say, and any man alive can show you a handsome handful off the top of a foul heap. Never mind the color of a parcel the day it is bought, nor the fair face it wears on the market stall. Draw your own sample from the middle and the bottom, and tie it, and date it, and lay it by. The sample is the one witness that cannot be bribed, for it is the corn itself and not a word about the corn, and it will tell you in the baker's trough the exact truth of what you bought on the market, whether you wish to hear it or no. It was from that saying that the musters came, the little tied and dated bags of sample that were, though nobody in Shalcote knew it yet, presently to undo a duke. From every parcel she bought, good or ill, Verity Garner drew off a single true handful, from the middle of the sack and not the mouth of it, and tied it with a waxed thread, and wrote upon the linen in her small square hand the day and the farm and the price of it, and laid it upon a shelf in the cool north room that the house called the sample room, and there they hung in their rows, the sound harvests and the 2 poor ones, going back the better part of a decade. Each one a sworn witness laid up against the day some person should stand in the yard and tell her that her corn was not what she said it was. She could walk to that shelf in the dark, and put her hand on the wheat of any harvest you named, and untie it, and pour it out upon the counter, and let the town match it against the bulk for itself. And it was her quiet, unspoken, and entirely accurate opinion that a factor who dared not do as much was no factor, but only a seller of a thing, while it was too well hidden in the sack to contradict him. It is necessary to say plainly, because the parlors of the town said it often, and a good deal less kindly, what Verity Garner was not. She was not a beauty, though a long way from plain. She had a clear, composed, attending face, and a way of looking at whoever was speaking as though what they said might presently be weighed against the market book and the truth of it. She was not accomplished. She could cast up 3 columns of quarters and 2 of price faster than the Duke's own clerk, but she could not sing, and had let her drawing lapse at the age when other young ladies took it up, and she was not married, a circumstance the town laid at the door of the dust upon her hymn, and her unwomanly ease upon a threshing floor, and her father at the door of the poverty of the arithmetic that had so far offered itself, for she had observed early that a solvent factor's only daughter draws a particular sort of suitor, had priced that sort with accuracy, and found him light. She had, in short, all the qualities that make a woman invaluable behind a counter and invisible in a drawing-room, and had made her peace with the exchange a good while before the Duke of Wraxall came down from town to teach her, as he supposed, the difference between the two. that she was not to be trifled with in the matter of a parcel. The whole trade had known these 4 years, since the business of the heated barley, and it is worth the telling, for it is the same woman doing the same thing that she would presently do to a duke. A jobber had come to Garner's with a bargain. 60 quarters of malting barley to be had cheap of a failing man at Norrington, dry as a bone, he swore, and only wanting a buyer with the loft room to hold it. And old Silas, being tired, and the man being plausible, and the price being very low, would have bought. But his daughter had gone up and drawn her own handful from the middle of 3 sacks chosen not by the jobber, but by herself, and had come down and said, in the level voice, that she was very sorry, but that the barley was already heating at the heart, and would be musty before it was malted, and that a low price on a heating parcel was the dearest corn in England. And would he perhaps like to tell her honestly how long it had lain unturned, and in whose close loft, for it had plainly not been an airy one. The jobber had gone away without his bargain, and without his temper, and it had come out within the 12-month that the whole 60 quarters had gone blue and musty on the man who did buy them, and had ruined a small malting at Pyborne that could not afford the loss, and the saving of £200 and a year of the house's good name had been owing to a young woman who would draw her own handful from her own choosing, and would not sign her father's money to a parcel that the sack had already condemned. The trade had laughed about it, and shaken its head and called her a sharp piece. But the trade had also, quietly, brought its honest bargains to Verity Garner ever after, which is the only kind of compliment a corn-house can bank. It will be as well, before we go on, to say what manner of thing it was that the Duke proposed to sweep away, for the corn trade is not at all the simple matter that a man who has only eaten the bread supposes. A corn factor did not grow the wheat nor bake the loaf. He stood between the two, buying the farmer's grain in the great parcels of the harvest, and selling it on in the smaller ones the bakers and the millers could use, week by week through the year, and carrying the whole weight of the Vale's bread upon his judgment and his cellarage from one harvest to the next. And the whole strength and peril of his trade lay not in the buying at all, but in the keeping and the honesty of it. For a factor got his bakers and held them by fair dealing, selling them a true measure of a sound grain at a price they could bake a living loaf from, and carrying an honest man through a dear quarter in the sure knowledge that a solvent baker is worth more to a factor than a dozen ruined ones and an empty shop on his hands. It was a thing that could be done well or vilely. Done vilely, it was the old and hated sin the law had a hard word for, engrossing and forestalling and regrating, to buy up the whole of a scarce grain into few hands, and hold it back from the market, and stand between a hungry town and its bread until want had driven the price where the holder pleased, and then to sell it dear to the very people it had been kept from. Done well, it was very nearly a public trust. Old Silas Garner had done it well for 40 years, buying no more than he could keep sweet, selling steadily in dear times as in cheap, so that the Vale's bread never leapt under his hand, and asking of his bakers only what a loaf could truly pay. And the 11 little bakehouses that drew Garner's flour, the wheat sheaf and the leaven and the oven in the wall and the rest, were tied to the house by a cord a good deal tougher than any bond, which was that their factor had sound corn to sell and a price they could live by, and knew to a nicety what they would lose if they gave both up for a sealed granary, and a rumour of famine. The whole of it stood or fell, like the wharf and the ledger of older honest trades, upon a single thing, and that thing was truth. That the grain sold was truly the grain it was sold for, the sample the honest witness of the whole heap, and not a handsome lie skimmed off the top, and the corn so dryly bought and so faithfully turned and so airily kept that it would live out its long wait between the harvests and come sweet to the baker's trough, a season after it left the farmer's rick. For 40 years Garner's corn had done exactly that. Old Silas had outlived 2 clerks of the market and a dozen dear years, and not one baker in all that time had sent a sack back to the house heated, or musty, or short of measure. And the reason was the same reason his daughter kept her musters, which was that the Garners had never once in 2 generations sold a parcel they had not first proved to themselves, handful by handful, that the trough would not shame. It was not a glamorous distinction, and it had never once made them rich. But it was the thing that stood, in the November of this history, between 11 honest bakers and their ruin, and between a hungry town and a winter of engrossed bread, and it was kept, parcel by parcel and muster by muster, in a woman's hand. Of Silas Garner himself there is not a great deal to say, except that he was a good and honest and frightened old man, which is a harder thing to be than either of the first 2 alone. He had kept his house straight through a long war and a longer peace by the simple and exhausting method of never once selling a sack he would be ashamed to knead in his own kitchen. But he was aging now, and short of breath, and easily alarmed, and the raising of the Duke's great stores had frightened him more than any wet harvest in 50 years. For a wet harvest he understood, and a corner in the market he did not. He had begun to lean upon his daughter in the way the old lean upon the young, when the world changes its shape faster than they can follow, half in gratitude and half in a querulous fear that she would do something bold and bring the great new gentleman down upon them. And it was one of the quieter heroisms of that year, and quite unrecorded anywhere but here, that Verity Garner carried her father's fear as well as her own, and let him see only the one, and held his hand steady upon the pen when it shook, and told him every night that all would be well, upon the strength of a shelf of tied musters, and a conviction that an honest sample does not lie. Her one ally of any weight was old Diggory, the Granary man, and he was an ally chiefly, in the sense that the north wind itself was an ally. Cold, immovable, and exactly where you had left it. Diggory had turned the corn of Garner's loft for 50 years, man and boy, with a wooden shovel and an arm like a flail, in the sure and simple faith that 9/10 of all the grain ever spoiled in England was spoiled, not in the growing, but in the keeping, by a lazy man who would not turn it, and a mean one who would not air it, and he kept the great loft swept, and the shutters set to the weather, and turned the musters parcels with his own hands, and had for the factor's daughter the gruff, total, unspoken loyalty of an old servant of good corn, for the one young person left in the parish who valued the thing he had given his life to. He had no opinions upon the science of commerce, and none upon the freedom of trade, and would not have crossed the yard to hear Mr. Hartop read his figures, but he knew to a certainty what a warm, close autumn would do to a damp heap left unturned in a sealed dark, and he could no more have been got to seal a loft on a sweating parcel than to sell short measure to a widow, and when it came at last to the pinch, it would be old Diggory's swept loft and old diggories turned corn, standing up behind her tied musters that no gentleman's subscription could argue away. The great corner was a different notion altogether, and a very modern one. Mr. Hartop's beautiful pamphlet had shown, and the whole county had believed it, because it was printed, and because there was a wharf full of granaries to prove it, that the future of the trade lay not in a string of little honest factors, each keeping no more than his own bakers could eat, but in a single great combination, buying up the whole Vale's grain at a stroke, holding it out of the market through the hungry months, and naming the price of the loaf to a starving county. It was, upon paper, unanswerable, and paper was the element in which the whole county had lately learned to live. It was also a scheme with a flaw in it that no subscription could mend, for a corner rests upon a famine, and a famine cannot be ordered up to suit a ledger. Mr. Hartop had wagered the Duke's whole capital upon the wet of the past summer holding on into a ruined harvest, but the corn was already in the ground and out of any pamphleteer's reach, and if the weather turned kind and the harvest came in heavy, the price must break, and every quarter the corner had bought dear would be worth a fraction of its cost, and the borrowed money that had bought it would be called in upon a heap that could not be sold. A scheme built to profit by a nation's hunger, she had thought, is a scheme that must pray for the hunger to continue, and there is no prayer the sky answers less kindly. And she had looked at the long sealed granaries, and at the smooth, impatient gentleman who was filling them, and had felt the first cold touch of a certainty she had then no evidence for, and no leave to speak. But that was an objection upon the theory of corners, and nobody upon that bright July forenoon, with the collation laid out and the fortunes as good as made, had the smallest wish on earth to hear it. The way the thing was to be done in practice was a good deal less picturesque than the pamphlet, and it was the part of the business the striped awning had not been raised to discuss. The Duke did not mean merely to build great stores and trust to their bigness to win the trade. He meant to sweep the standing grain into his own hands first, and name the price of it afterward, and he had a man to sweep it for him. Mr. Sallow, his man of business, was a dry, close, capable person of middle age, with a soft step and a hard eye and a copperplate hand, who understood to a nicety the one thing about the corn trade that the projector's figures had left out, which was that a corner is worth exactly the number of bakers who have nowhere else to buy, and not a bushel more. All that summer, while the granaries filled, Mr. Sallow had been quietly going about the Vale with the Duke's money, buying up the standing crops before they were cut, contracting for whole fields at the barn door, outbidding the honest factors at every market, and calling in the little debts that lay upon 3 parishes' worth of small farmers and millers, so that a man who owed a struggling corn factor £30 found the debt bought up by a duke and called in sharp, with a bailiff's civility, and the terms of its forgiveness always the same, and always gentle in the phrasing and iron in the fact. Sell your crop to the Duke's stores and to no other, or find the whole sum by quarter day. Field by field, over that summer, the great sealed granaries were gathering the Vale's whole loaf into one hand before a sheaf was carried, and the little factors who had served the town for a generation found the farmers' gates shut against them that had stood open at Lady Day. Against garners, this engine had been set to work early, and had so far entirely failed, for a reason, Mr. Sallow noted in his book with the particular irritation of a tidy man before an untidy fact. The Garner bakers would not be bought, and the Garner farmers would not be frightened. Sallow had gone to the 11 bakehouses with his soft step and his civil terms and his purse, and had found to his surprise that there were scarcely any debts to buy, that Verity Garner sold her bakers little on credit, and squeezed them less, so that the Wheatsheaf owed almost nothing, and the leaven rather less, and what small sums were owing on terms so easy that no baker in his senses would exchange them for a duke's mercy, and that even the 2 or 3 he might have squeezed would not be squeezed, because their masters asked plainly whether they would take a stranger's engrossed corn to be quit of a friend's small loan, had looked at him as though he had proposed they sell their own ovens, and had gone on drawing garners. He raised the offer. It made no difference. Honest Master Fothergill of the Wheatsheaf, who had baked Garner's flour for 30 years and buried a wife on Verity Garner's forbearance in a bad winter, told him to his face, over his own trough, that he would sooner shut his oven than sell his neighbours a loaf out of corn cornered against them, and that he had bought a sack of the Duke's fine sealed wheat of a Saturday, and it had come up, musty in the sponge, and Mr. Sallow might carry that back to the wharf with his compliments. Sallow carried back instead a shorter and a graver report, which was that the little house by the cross could not be starved out in the ordinary way, because it had done the one thing his whole engine was built to punish, and done it too long ago to undo. It had made itself trusted by being honest, and an honesty of 20 years' standing is a debt no duke can call in. It was at this point, the bakers immovable, the granaries filling, and the whole handsome scheme balked by an obstinate spinster and 11 grateful ovens, that the Duke had gone down to open his great stores, and, being asked by nobody, had been given Verity Garner's opinion of his keeping, and had returned it, as we have seen, with the advice about the sacks. He had done it carelessly, as a man swats at a fly that has interrupted a pleasant thought, and had forgotten it before the collation was cleared, and it is the mark of the sort of man he then was, that he never once considered that the fly might keep a book, or that the whole difference between the 2 of them in the end would be that she remembered exactly what she had said, and precisely why, and he could not afterward recall a word of his own. He had built his corner upon a projector's figures and a man of business's purse. She had built her house upon 40 years of an honest sample and a swept loft, and the harvest was coming that would prove them both. Her own answer to the striped awning was not a word, but a series of transactions, entered that same week in the market book in her small square hand, and calculated with a coolness that would have alarmed the Duke considerably had he been the sort of man who reads a woman's ledger. She did not rail, and she did not repine, and she did not, which her father, poor man, had lain awake dreading, go up to the wharf to have it out with anybody. She went instead very quietly to her 11 bakers, and renewed with the 2 whose agreements fell due that year upon terms a shade easier than before, and carried the leaven a dear quarter it could ill pay against a promise of nothing but its custom, and thereby bound the whole 11 to the house with a cord the Duke's whole purse could not cut, because it was made of a thing his purse had never learned to buy. Then she went to the honest farmers of the higher vale that Sallow's men had not yet frightened, the small men on the light land that ripened early and dry, and contracted for their standing crops before the corner's price had climbed, and paid them fairly and in hand, for she had reasoned, standing in the loft with her scoop, that a corner rests upon a bad harvest, and that a bad harvest was by no means the certain thing the pamphlet swore it, and that she would meet the year with the soundest early grain in the vale, and a swept airy loft, and let the Duke meet it with his sealed dark and his borrowed money, and let the bakers of 3 parishes be the judges between them by Michaelmas. And then she went back to her counter, and did all through that ripening summer the one unspectacular thing that was in the end to undo him. She bought honestly, and turned faithfully, and sealed nothing damp, and drew and tied her muster of every parcel, and she waited for the weather, with the particular patience of a person who has read the account before it is cast up and knows to a farthing how it must come out. The weather came as she had read it. That summer of 1817, which the pamphlet had sold as the second wet ruin in a row, turned in the last week of July to a long, steady warmth, dry and open, that ripened the vale's wheat golden and hard, and carried it into the barns as sound a harvest as any man then living could remember. Field after field came in heavy and dry, the ricks rose fat along the higher land, and week by golden week, as the corn was carried and threshed, and the plenty of it could no longer be hidden, the great famine that Mr. Hartop had proved upon paper melted quietly off the face of the county, and the price of wheat which the corner had driven up all the wet spring upon the promise of a dearth began its long, slow fall toward what an honest, heavy harvest is worth. It was the making of Verity Garner's year, and, though no man on the Duke's list yet knew it, the unmaking of his corner. For the granaries had been sealed at last through June and July, filled to the rafters with grain bought damp and dear upon a wager of famine, and Mr. Sallow, with a great borrowed capital, crying for its profit, and a market that would not climb, had done in the fact precisely the thing that Verity Garner had foretold in the theory. He had held. He had kept the sealed granaries shut against a falling price, waiting for the famine that was not coming, in the sure certainty that to sell now was to sell at a loss, and the grain within them, bought damp and packed close, and left unturned through the warm still weeks of that open autumn, did the one thing that a great close heap of damp corn does, and does without fail, and cares nothing for the capital sunk in it. It heated, and it musted, and it grew its blue rot in the dark. The Duke's own granary keeper had said as much, and been overruled, and it is only justice to him to record it. Old Redfern, whom the Duke had hired for the look of his experience, and then forbidden the use of it, was a sworn corn-meter of the honest sort, who had gone through the sealed stores in August, with a face growing longer by the day, and had told Mr. Sallow to his face that the grain was not keeping, only waiting, that it had been binned damp and packed too close, and wanted turning and airing before ever it was closed down, and that to hold it sealed against a falling market in a warm autumn was to breed must and rot and lose the whole heap and the Duke's name with it. Mr. Sallow had heard him out with his soft civility, and had asked whether Mr. Redfern proposed to pay the interest on the borrowed capital out of his own pocket during the turning in question, and had then given the order to keep the granaries shut. And Redfern, who was a corn-meter and not a hero and had a family, had thrust his measuring iron into the heart of the great bins, and felt the heat rising in them, with the particular sick misery of a good workman made to watch good grain spoil, and had begun that same week, without a word to anybody, to look about him quietly for another place, and to think with an odd and growing frequency of the tied musters they said the Garner girl kept on the shelf of her north room by the cross. By the second week of November the thing had happened all through the sealed stores at once, as a thing long prepared happens suddenly. The corner broke, and the grain rotted, and the two calamities fell upon the Duke together. The price of wheat, which honest men had watched sink all the golden autumn, dropped at last below the very figure at which the corner had bought, so that every quarter in the great granaries was now worth less than the borrowed money laid out on it, and the lenders, seeing the market broken and the harvest heavy, and no famine coming to save the wager, called in their loans upon a hoard that could not be sold at any price to cover them. And when at last the sealed doors were opened in a hurry to raise what they might, the grain came out of the close dark, not golden but grey, heated at the heart, musty and blue moulded and caked into the corners, a great part of it fit for nothing but the pigs, and the rest to be sold at a ruinous loss into a market already glutted with sound corn. It was ruin, and it was a ruin of the Duke's own precise manufacture, for he had first tried to take from a hungry county every loaf but his, and then found, when the county proved not hungry after all, that the loaf he had hoarded had rotted in his hand, and the county, which is never slow to see a joke against a great man once the great man has furnished it, began to see this one, and to repeat under its own smaller awnings the observation of Miss Garner of the Market Cross concerning a heap being worth what it proved in the trough 3 months on, and not a farthing of what it looked in the sack the day it was bought. And through it all, in the 11 bakehouses by the cross, Garner's corn stood sweet in Diggory's swept loft, and came sound to the trough. The wheat sheaf drew honest flour to an oven busier than it had been in years. And honest Fothergill told any gentleman who would listen exactly why. And the little house that a duke had pronounced finished in July could not, in that broken November, buy fast enough to answer the custom of a town that had suddenly and gratefully rediscovered the difference between bread and the promise of bread. The Duke of Wraxall was not a stupid man, and this is the place to say it, for the story does him the justice his conduct earns and no more. But he was a proud one, and a proud man's first act upon the failure of his own scheme is very seldom to examine the scheme, and is very often to look about for the person whose obstinacy is plainly the cause of it. He had a great borrowed capital sunk and cronking for its interest, a list of frightened subscribers, a county beginning to laugh, and a little house by the cross whose corn had insolently declined to rot when his own had so signally succeeded in it. And instead of asking why his granaries had heated, he asked, with the whole force of an injured self-love, how the Garner corn could possibly be as sound and as full of measure as the impudent town pretended, and satisfied himself, upon no evidence but his need, that it could not be, that it was luck, or an airy loft, or a small parcel easily minded, or very likely a good deal of baker's brag, and a little quiet skimming of the sacks. And he resolved, against the advice of the one honest corn-meter left on his premises, to prove it so in public, and mend his credit at a stroke. He would call a public measuring. He would bring his own corn and the garner corn to the corn hall before the whole town on the November market day, and set them side by side, and expose the pretense of the little house before the very people who were laughing at his own. And he had so far persuaded himself of the outcome that he never once asked the only question a factor would have asked first, which was whether Miss Garner would bring a sack to be measured or a shelf of witnesses to be matched. The measuring was held, as these things are, before the largest company the town could muster, in the long corn hall on the afternoon of the November market, with the Duke and his list at the head of the board, and Mr. Sallow at his shoulder, and half the county crowded to the walls. And it began as a public execution and ended as a different one. The Duke's corn was brought first, a fair open sack of it, chosen with care from the soundest bin the ruined stores could yield, and skimmed bright at the mouth, and it was, to do it justice, a handsome-looking parcel at the top, plump and golden to the eye, and the board looked easier at the sight of it. Then Verity Garner, who had come at the summons in her plain grey gown with old Diggory carrying a small basket behind her, was asked, with a courtesy that did not trouble to hide its confidence, to produce the celebrated Garner corn, and she set upon the board not a fresh sack at all, but a single small linen bag, tied and dusty and dated, and said, in the level and unhurried voice the county was by now beginning to lean forward to hear, that she thought a sack chosen by the seller no fair test of anything, since any fool could show a handsome handful off the top of a bin, and that the whole question between the wharf and the cross was not what a parcel looked at the mouth, but what it proved to the middle and the bottom, and that this muster had been drawn from the heart of a parcel she had sold the town in the October of the year before, and tied and dated that same day, and had hung in her north room untouched from that hour to this. And she asked that his own corn-meter, old Redfern, standing unhappy at the board, as the one man present whom nobody could accuse of partiality to her, should thrust the iron himself into the Duke's own open sack, and draw from the middle and the bottom of it, and match what he drew against her tied muster, and say honestly before them all what he found. There are moments a proud man sees coming a half-second before they arrive and cannot stop, and the Duke had one of them then in the thrusting of that iron, for he saw, in the sudden stillness of old Redfern's face, as the grain ran out of the middle of the sack, that he had walked his own credit into a trap of his own building, and that the trap had been baited a year ago by a woman drawing a handful from the heart of a parcel against exactly this afternoon, and that there was now no honourable way out of the hole but through. Redfern drew the iron. From the mouth the Duke's corn ran bright and plump, as it had promised, but from the middle and the bottom it ran grey and caked and blue at the heart, musty to the nose across the whole hushed hall, heated in the sealed dark till it had bound itself into lumps, and Redfern poured it out beside the little muster, and the muster lay sweet and golden and loose and clean-smelling upon the board, every grain of it sound, and he smelled the one and then the other, and rolled a few grains of each between his hard palms, and set them down, and said, in the flat, unhappy voice of an honest man doing the one honest thing left to him, that the Garner sample was as sweet a wheat as he had handled in 40 years in the trade, drawn true from the heart of its parcel, and not skimmed from the top, and that there was no skimming on this earth that could counterfeit it, for a muster is the corn itself and not a word about the corn, and this one had honestly kept its truth. And then, because he was asked, and because he had made up his mind that morning that he would not be forsworn for any board in England, he thrust the iron a second time into the Duke's fine sack, slowly, in the same silence, and drew it grey again, and set it down, and said more quietly still, that his lordship's corn was fair at the mouth, and rotten at the heart, heated and musted for want of turning, and that he had said as much in August, and would say it again now, and the board might do with him as it pleased. The little tied muster, drawn by a spinster from the middle of a sack, against a day she could not have named, had matched the whole of the Duke's corner to the bottom as surely as it matched itself. And the discredit he had brought to the corn hall to hang upon the little house settled instead, before the eyes of the entire laughing county, upon the great sealed granaries on the wharf. It should have ended there, and in a simpler man it would have. But the Duke's pride, driven from the field of the corn, made its last stand upon the woman, and it is this that gives the story its turn, and Verity Garner her finest hour. For Mr. Sallow, seeing his master's face, and his own scheme in the same ruin, leaned in and said the thing that close-hard men always have by them for such a moment, said it low, but not so low that the head of the board missed it, and the head of the board, God forgive him, in the misery of his exposure, for one instant half believed it, that all this was very pretty, but that a woman's little bags of corn were no evidence a court or a market need respect, that it was housewife's work and a handful of wheat tied up in a rag, that anybody might keep one sweet sample by for show, and that the whole performance was a trick of the market, and Miss Garner's success no more than the luck of an airy loft and a small parcel and a good deal of baker's brag got up to. Shame her betters. And the Duke, stung and shamed and grasping, let his eyes go to her as though the slander might be a rope out of the pit, and did not at once say no. Verity Garner looked at the two of them for a moment in her considering way, as though what they had said might presently be weighed against the book, and found as it was light. And then she did not raise her voice, for she never did. She said that Mr. Sallow was very welcome to his opinion of her musters, and that she had brought, as it happened, the means of curing him of it. And she had old Diggory set the basket upon the board, and take from it not one bag, but 9, each tied and dusty, and written over in her small square hand, the musters of 9 harvests running. And she set them in a row before the board like a squared account, and said that here was a true handful drawn from the heart of every parcel her house had sold these 9 years. The 2 poor harvests with the good, each tied and dated the day it was bought, and none of them opened till this hour, and that the company might choose any bag of any year they pleased, at random, by the date upon the linen, and send to any baker in the town who still held corn of that buying, and match the muster against the bulk then and there, and see for themselves whether the little house kept one sweet sample by for show, or dealt true to the bottom of every sack as a plain matter of trade. Let them untie the lot, she said. If 9 were not enough, her father had taught her to draw them precisely, so that no gentleman need ever take her word, and she would a great deal rather be proved than believed. And she turned to the Duke, and said the only hard thing she said that whole afternoon, in the same level voice, which made it the harder, that she was not a correction for a bad speculation, your grace, nor a convenience to be produced when his own corn had shamed him, that she had been a factor in July when he told her to sell her scoop for old brass, and was the same factor in November that an airy loft had not made and a sealed one had only proved. and that he might match her 9 musters and welcome, but that he would take no terms from her that afternoon, then or after, for she did not do business across a board where her word had just been called a housewife's fancy, and she wished the company a very good day. And she left the 9 bags standing on the board as her witnesses, and walked out of the corn hall composed, with old Diggory and his empty basket behind her, and did not once look to see whether the Duke watched her go, which, the whole room being able to attest that he did, and bareheaded too, was rather the completest thing she could have done. Here we must for a while look through the other window, for the remainder of the story is the Duke's to travel and not hers, and it is only by seeing it as he came to see it that the reader will understand why a proud man's defeat became the truest thing that ever happened to him. He went home from the corn hall that evening, a good deal changed, though he would not for some days admit by what, and he did the thing that pride does when the corn has rotted, and the woman has walked out, and the county is laughing, which is that at last, having no one left to blame, he began to examine the scheme. He sent for the coroner's books, not the fair figures Mr. Hartop had drawn, but the true ones, and he sat up 3 nights over them with a branch of candles and a slow and dreadful understanding. And he found in them, entry by entry, the whole of what Verity Garner had told him for nothing under the awning in July, the grain bought damp to fill the bins faster, the turning struck off to save the labour, the granaries sealed against a falling market on Mr. Sallow's order and over the corn meter's written protest, the borrowed capital, the whole handsome ruin costed to a farthing in his own agent's copperplate. And he found, kept quietly in a second book that Mr. Sallow had not meant him to see, the true reckoning of the corner itself, the standing crops bought up at the barn door, the little debts called in, the honest factors starved out, the farmers frightened, the whole engine built to stand between a hungry county and its bread, and understood at last that his great modern scheme had been, from the first sealed door, precisely the old and hated sin the law had once hanged men for, the engrossing of a people's food against a dear year, and that the only difference between his stores and Verity Garner's little house was that she had bound her bakers by being honest to them for 20 years, and he had bound his farmers by being cruel to them for 1, and that the corn had known the difference even when he had not. He dismissed Mr. Sallow within the week, and without a character, and he kept old Redfern, and raised him, and asked his advice, and took it, and then, having set his own house in what order he could, he did the last and hardest thing, which was to put on his hat and walk down to the cross alone. He came to the little house of Garner's on a bright, cool December forenoon, a year and some months from the day he had told her to sell her scoop, and he came as she had made men come before him, bare-headed to the plain scrubbed counter with his tall hat against his breast, and everything he saw as he waited for her was reasoned, and he had by now the wit and the humility to see that it was. The yard was swept and busy. The great loft breathed its cool, dry sweetness down the ladder into the counting room. The sacks stood turned and sound in their ranks. The shelf of tied musters ran back into the north room dark, a plain, unanswerable account of 40 years of not being ashamed, and the woman who kept it all came down from the loft with dust on her hem and her scoop in her hand, and looked at him without triumph and without fear, as though he were a jobber come with a bargain she would examine on its merits, and not a moment before. He said his business plainly, which was more than he had ever done under the awning, that she had been right upon every particular and he wrong upon all of them, that his corn had rotted exactly as and exactly when she said it would, and hers had kept exactly as she said it would, and that he had come to ask if she would sell it to a man who had not deserved to buy, whether the little house would take on the great stores his own folly had filled and spoiled, and the ruined farmers and frightened millers his corner had bound, and deal for the town the honest grain he had not had the sense to let them keep. He asked it as a favor, and named no price, having learned that much, and he waited, hat in hand, for the woman he had called finished, to tell him what her forbearance would cost him. What it cost him surprised him, as her prices always afterward surprised him, by being less than his necessity would have paid, and a great deal more than his pride had expected. She did not gouge him, though she might have, for she held the sweet corn and the trusting bakers, and he held a heap of rot and a wharf he could not pay for. She named for the whole of the great stores, and its spoiled hoard a figure so plainly fair that old Redfern, when he heard it, went away and thought about it for an hour, and when the Duke, wondering, asked her why she did not take him at his need as any man of business would, she gave him the answer that he carried about with him for the rest of his life, and quoted to his aunt, and at last to his children. She said that she meant to buy this county its bread for the next 30 years, and to his house after him, and that a factor who ruins a neighbor in a dear season buys herself a bad name that outlasts the bargain, that his successor's custom was worth a great deal more to her than his bad afternoon, and the town's goodwill more than either, and that she would take his stores at a fair price and set his frightened farmers back on their feet, and deal the town a loaf they need not be ashamed to eat. Not because she forgave him, she said this without heat, as a plain term of trade, but because it was better business to be the town's honest factor for 30 years than its engrosser for one, and she had always, she said, preferred a long account to a sharp one. It was the Duke's final and most complete instruction in the difference between the front of a thing and the back of it, and he had the grace, this time, to walk round to the back and look. The stores were bought, and the farmers set up again, and the ruined granaries by the wharf held sweet, turned corn within the 12-month, under old Redfern's honest iron, and Verity Garner's honest book. And the county, which had laughed first at her and then at the Duke, ended by taking a considerable local pride in them both, in the manner of counties, and told the story of the 9 musters at the Corn Hall for a generation, improving it as it went. The Duke of Wraxall was not punished, for the story is not of that kind, and he did not grovel, for she would have thought less of him if he had. He was out-reasoned and out-kept, and converted by the plain evidence of a handful of wheat, and he came to her afterward, not as a penitent, but as a pupil, which suited them both a great deal better. He took to walking down to the cross of an evening, upon one pretext or another, to be taught the things his figures had left out, the drawing of a true sample, the reading of the standing crop from the color of a field in June, the trick of knowing by the warmth of a thrust hand alone whether a bin was sweet or heating, and it was observed by Mrs. Tolliver, who observed everything, that a man does not spend a wet December learning the theory of wheat from a woman he means only to buy a warehouse from, and that the Duke's education was proceeding upon lines that would end, if the town were any judge, at the altar of Chalcote Church. The town was a judge, and it did, His aunt, the Dowager Lady Bracewell, a plain-spoken old woman who had watched the whole affair from town with a dry relish, put the case to him herself when he told her how it stood, and he was honest enough to laugh at it. She observed that he had gone down into the Vale the year before to corner a troublesome little market and be rid of a troublesome little factor, and appeared now to be proposing, at very considerable trouble and expense, to marry her instead, and asked whether, upon reflection, he could tell her what precisely he had meant by that speech under the awning about the sacks and the scoop, of which the whole county still spoke. And the Duke of Wraxall, the most modern and the least anxious gentleman upon that side of the shire, found that he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it at all, could not recover one syllable of the certainty that had made him say it, and told his aunt so, and understood, in the telling, that this forgetting was the exact measure of how far he had come from the man who had said it, for the thing he had thought so obvious that a woman need not be looked at while it was said had turned out, on examination, to have no back to it whatever, and a thing with no back to it is soon indistinguishable, even to the man who built it, from the empty air it was always made of. He asked her plainly at the last, and not across a business board, and she considered him in her weighing way, as though his question too must be proved and not merely believed, and then accepted him, upon her own terms, which were that the corn book should be kept, as it had always been kept, in her own hand, and that she should go on being a factor, for she had no notion of leaving off a thing she did well to take up being a duchess, a thing she should have to learn, and he, who had at last acquired sense enough to know his good fortune when it stood before him with dust on its hem, agreed to every word of it, and thought himself let off cheap, and was right. They were married in the spring, quietly, at Chalcote Church, with old Silas giving her away glad and shaking, and old Diggory scrubbed pink in the second pew, and honest Fothergill of the Wheatsheaf, and all 11 bakers filling the back of the church in their Sunday coats, and at the wedding breakfast, which was held in the long, cool counting room of the little house, and not at Wraxall Court. The bride caused to be brought down from the north room a single small linen bag, tied with a waxed thread and thick with dust, and set it before her husband to open with his own hand. It was drawn and tied, she told him, from the heart of a parcel she had sold the town in the October of the year he had told her the house was finished, and she thought he might like to see, now, what had been quietly keeping its truth in the dark all the while he had been so sure it could not be sound. He untied the thread, and the wheat of the year he had called her finished poured out upon the cloth after its long patience, golden and loose and sweet, every grain of it whole and clean smelling, the plain, honest corn of an honest buying, and he ran a little of it through his fingers, and looked at her over the handful, and had the good sense to say nothing at all, which was the wisest thing he had learned to do in the whole of his education. And that is the end of it, or nearly, for the harvest keeps a truer account than any speculator, and can be neither talked up nor frightened down into swearing to a lie, and will tell you in its own good autumn the exact truth of what was done in the spring, whether the doer be a spinster by a cross or a duke with a wharf, and what is honestly grown and honestly sampled is honest to the bottom of the sack, and stands, and what is cornered against the hungry will heat and rot in the sealed dark, though you gild the granary with a lord's own arms, and subscribe to it before the quality. On the mantel of the long counting room at Garner's, where they chose to live the half of every year, there stood ever after a single tied linen bag of wheat from the October he had called her finished, never opened and never meant to be, only kept, because it had never needed opening to be true, and needed no threshing now to go on being so. It only needed to have been honestly drawn, and honestly tied, and honestly let alone. If a story of a patient harvest and a woman with a better account than her betters was worth an hour of your evening, you might let the little house by the cross know it, a word set down below that the tale ran true to the last grain, is the only receipt a teller ever asks, and there will be another drawn and tied and laid by, and poured out in its own good time whenever you have a mind to see it.